We'd like to welcome a supporter, sponsor, and friend of both Dr. Nelson and myself, and that's Nationwide. And Nationwide has decided to support the Courageous Conversation podcast. So on behalf of Dr. Nelson, I would like to express our sincerest appreciation to the people at Nationwide for their support of the Courageous Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
So, Phil, we've been talking about the need to belong, and we talked about herds. But I want to talk about this concept of herd mentality and, how it creates separation in many ways. And I think, I can't remember which show I was listening to or watching recently, but the differences between the herds have in a global basis have gotten further and further apart, and the ability to collaborate, cooperate, commiserate, and come up with a common ground have become much more difficult. So the herd mentality in politics, in many ways, has led to some of the Supreme Court decisions that we've seen. Has it not?
I'm not sure I'm able to expound on that. I think I might become the student here. First of all, I don't think that our divisions have widened. I think they've hardened. I think that is not a distinction without a difference. I don't hear a difference in latitude between our differences. What I hear is an unwillingness to even discuss those differences that might have some common ground. And that's why I think it is hardened. Our positions have hardened, or at least they've hardened because one of the sides hardened and the other has to harden just to keep from being rolled over.
What I'm seeing is the herd, and we can look at this from a voting standpoint, the herd votes together. And when somebody doesn't vote with the rest of the herd, if the sheep wanders off from the rest of the herd, they become ostracized. They become a target for the herd. And we've seen that from a political standpoint. And we've seen an effort from this hardened group to not listen or be willing to listen to the other hardened group and look for compromise in different rules, laws, legislations, activities. And so this herd mentality is such that when you don't follow the lead of the herd, you're a pariah.
So I think we've reached a point where we've taken our analogies a little too far.
Okay.
in terms of herd behavior. We started by saying, I've never necessarily seen a political herd, but if we're going to apply it to human beings, coercion, consequences of exclusion or inclusion are always a part of our psychology in our herd mentality. I totally agree with you there. However, you cannot just stick with this monolithic analogy to explain our political behaviors. So I'm going to create another analogy for you. There was an experiment done where in apes, in chimpanzees, as a matter of fact, they acclimated them into expecting bananas at a certain time of day, every day. And then one day they changed things up and they just hung a pole of bananas in the middle of the room. But they continued to deliver bananas at the same time. But when they hung the bananas up in the middle of the room, the chimpanzees immediately went to pick their own bananas. And then they used a water hose on everybody who picked a banana off the pole. And they habituated these chimpanzees to the point that they could hang the bananas up anytime they wanted to. And the chimpanzees knew not to get one because they would get hosed. And they realized that those bananas could sit there all they want. They were going to still get their bananas at the same time every day. But if they wanted an extra banana, they were going to get wet, and they didn't want to get wet. So eventually, that just became an unwritten rule. After a while, they didn't have to hose any of the chimpanzees at all. They could hang fresh bananas anytime they wanted to, and nobody would get a banana. Then they introduced a new chimpanzee, and the new chimpanzee came in, saw the bananas, went straight for the pole, and the other chimpanzees jumped on that chimpanzee and beat him up, and essentially taught that chimpanzee not to touch those bananas. Every time they introduced a new chimpanzee, all of them would teach that chimpanzee not to touch bananas. And I'm sure that every once in a while it didn't work. Chimpanzee made it, and then they all got hosed. But after a while, there was no more hosing. The chimpanzees maintained a rule that had been started months ago by being hosed. My point is that that's not a democracy anymore. That's a dictatorship. We dictated their behavior, and they simply followed it through what you call herd mentality, because they didn't think that the consequences was worth it. And as long as they were getting paid bananas, it was okay. Having a little more luxury wasn't worth it to them, to work through the pain of being hosed.
So you don't see some of that in some of the groups, organizations, political parties that have their own.
Why do you think I brought this story up? Why would you say, I mean, come on. Obviously you missed the entire.
No, it was not questioning it. It was basically taking it and saying, well, it's pretty, okay, maybe I should have said, let me retract. It's pretty obvious that story is being lived every day in Washington, D.C., in Sacramento, in Austin, Texas, in Albany, New York, and in churches, synagogues, and other organizations where you follow the leader because you don't want to get hosed.
Correct. And at some point, we don't even understand why we think this anymore.
Right. Our genotype becomes our phenotype from that standpoint. We've become so genetically or phenotypically changed that we won't even think, we don't want to get hosed anymore. So we just do what needs to be done to not get hosed.
Some people have never even seen anybody get hosed. They just heard that they might have.
Right.
You know, it's almost a fable, right?
Yes.
And I can't fight it because it's bigger than me. The moment you make it bigger than me, then all of a sudden you require personal courage. I've had people in my home of different political positions who are upset because they have been aligned with the leader of that party. And they don't necessarily believe it, but they don't know what to do because they won't talk to the other party. Essentially, what they're telling me is they would rather be aligned with the leader of their own party, even though they're crying about it, than to talk to somebody in another party.
It's like to be a part of the herd, H-E-R-D, you are to be seen, but not heard, H-E-A-R-D.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but it's so important to be a part of the herd that I do not want to be ostracized.
Right. Yeah.
Now that importance may be because I basically believe, and I keep hearing I believe in what the original party believed in. Well, what was that? And does the present party still believe that? And if so, show me. And if you can't, then your party has changed. It's like Ronald Reagan said, I didn't leave the party left me. Yeah,
well, I just came back from Boston. And so there's a tremendous amount of history in Boston. And
yes, there is.
We took a brief walking tour of the Freedom Trail. And the stories that we were taught in school, this goes back to history, and the stories that you get from the actors that take you along the paths don't always jive. And so we've heard all sorts of historical stories that are in our history books that maybe aren't validated with other information that doesn't make it into the history books. And I don't need to tell you about this because the history that you learned in the South and the history that I learned in the North are two different things in many ways as well. So going back and looking at history is interesting, but basically using history as the definition for today, which is, you know, what does the Republican Party look like? What was the Democratic Party look like? What was it defined back then? I mean, life changes, the world changes. I've become more and more of interested in history. I think as I get older and I've lived more history, I want to go back and learn more about history.
Yeah, I know. When you were talking about the education, I'm not so sure that your historical education was incorrect. It was just incomplete.
Yes. Yes. Now I did learn, and I remember this from my history, about Crispus Attucks.
Atticus.
Yes, Crispus Attucks being the first person killed at the American Revolution at the Boston Massacre, and the fact that
Well,
he was
but that happens in every movie. The black man's always the first one to die. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to demean his death.
Well, I mean, how many people knew that he was black?
I don't know. I know that it is generally common knowledge among African Americans, or because every Black History Month he comes up.
Right.
And it also shows you who pays attention to Black History Month. It's a much more symbolic issue for me. Crispus Attucks is, how many people know the demographic makeup of people who died in Vietnam?
It was predominantly black, 80%, I believe.
Yeah, right. How many people know the demographic makeup of the people who were sent to Vietnam? There's a reason why so many more African Americans died.
Go back to World War II and realize how long it took before we actually sent African Americans, Japanese, and even Hawaiian Americans into the war. And it was only because we were running out.
Let's correct that. We sent African Americans into the war immediately. They just weren't allowed to fight.
Before we gave them guns.
Yeah, before we gave them guns, right? But the point I was trying to make was, what do you have to do to prove your fealty to America? If the first man to die in Boston was black, why aren't we thought of as patriotic? It's easy to think of us as criminals if the first man who stole a loaf of bread is a crook. During the George Floyd reactions across the nation, all we heard of was how blacks were pilfering the stores and how sorry we were for J.C. Penney's, but it doesn't work the other way around.
Well, I'd just be interested, for those who listen to this podcast, how many actually knew Crispus Attucks was black, because I just think it's part of history that we learn a edited version of history.
If you learn it at all.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think we've talked about history and civics and everything else. What are we learning in school these days? Maybe are we too focused on STEM and not focused enough on foundational history and English and grammar and everything else?
Well, just like everything else. I mean, look, history is important, especially if we don't want to repeat it. So we definitely need to learn it. But education has to adapt to the environment as well. And what we don't like to do is throw things out until we feel that it is antagonistic to the way we want things to be. And so all of a sudden now we have these thought police that are throwing out any book that might undermine the whitewashed American perspective.
And you use that term intentionally.
I use that term intentionally because nobody else is washing history for America.
Yeah, I've never heard the term blackwash before, but I've heard blackmail.
You've heard blackmail, yes. And you also hear black perspective as if it is a unique form of history.
Well, it is interesting how we associate white with good and black with evil.
Yeah, well, that's one word for it. Interesting. No, without trying to over-examine that, it is what it is. This is the way we came. The black cat is evil. The white stallion stands for good.
I have one of each. Yeah, one white cat and one black cat. So
white crime is non-lethal, and the opposite is the angry black man. And yet, for the last 30 years, very few angry black men took AK-47s and shot up children. The only time that there was mass murder that I can think of by a black man, it was when an American government put an AK-47 in their hands and sent them to war.
We started this conversation kind of in that herd mentality and this tendency to follow the bull at the head of the herd, or the bull-headed person at the head of the herd. And I mean, we see this in animals all the time, but usually the person at the head of the herd with animals is there to protect and defend the herd, for lack of a better way to put it. Can we assume that in politics and other situations with the human herd, that the head of the herd is protecting his flock or herd as well?
Well, it all depends on the herd or flock you're talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As well as the bull,
Right.
right? Or the head, if it's not a bull, right? So, for instance, it is clear to me that the Prime Minister of us, or the President of Australia, was looking out for her country during the pandemic at the expense of her own reputation. She didn't care what it took. Or was it? No, I'm sorry, not Australia,
New Zealand.
New Zealand. Yeah. And she did and by all accounts, she did a pretty good job. Now, I don't know what kind of heat she took for restricting the freedoms temporarily that she had to, because she knew that viruses can't read a constitution, but she acted rationally, as opposed to leaders of two of the strongest nations in the world, one making a decision to invade another country simply because the other country is becoming democratic. And one could argue that he's looking out for the long-term interests of his own country, but that seems to be a stretch to me, especially when I'm looking at the violence and the eradication of people in that country in order to achieve what they're trying to achieve.
It's it's interesting in these analogies and metaphors between animals and people. Do you think the head of the pride, the head lion, takes a vote before he makes a decision? Or maybe it's not a he, or she, it may be a she. And the same thing with elephants and chimpanzees.
No, they don't. But
right.
Now you have to understand, most of their decisions is based on defense only.
Right.
Their decisions aren't as complicated as ours.
No, I fully understand that. I think it's defense, it's protection, it's survival.
And even behind that, I'm gonna go back to something I said in an earlier podcast. It's still about sex.
Yes, absolutely. That bull and that king of the jungle, they are there to propagate and make sure that everybody eats.
Right.
Food and sex.
That's right. And this is my pride. This is my herd. This is my colony, whatever it is. Fortunately, we have evolved.
You sure?
I am sure. But that evolution has created complications that I'm not sure we're good at handling. But I am sure that when the focus is no longer society, but personal gain, if we don't have appropriate checks and balances in place, then society suffers. The herd suffers.
None of the other animal species manipulate the democracy.
Well, there is no democracy. There is no democracy there.
Right.
Like, as you said, there is just basal. This is just cerebellar behavior.
Right.
There is no analogy. There is no animal analogy for democracy necessarily.
Right. So with this herd mentality, following individuals' efforts to keep that herd together at all costs is almost hypnotic in some cases, isn't it?
Well, maybe. In a moment of a defensive struggle or a protective struggle, testosterone may take over. That's not hypnosis. That's just fight or flight.
Right. But isn't the leader in some of our human herds using mental manipulation?
Well, yeah. Again, I can't keep up with you. Are you talking about the analogy, or are you talking about,
reality?
Let's talk reality here.
Talk reality.
Yes, of course. The January 6th hearings are showing a much more intentional, organized, pre-planned implementation designed to delay confirmation of the election in a hope that they could turn over the election. That meant lying to their support. That meant leveraging the basal suspicions of a certain demographic. It meant supporting and confirming those suspicions from a position of power and a position that should know whether it's true or not. And if you lie about it, then that's all I need. There were beliefs there that I don't know if you remember this, but some of the people that were there to save children. Did you know that? Some of the people that were in the January 6th insurrection, they were there to expose this Democratic cabal that ate children.
Oh, yes. The QAnon concept.
The QAnon, yes. Well, there were people that actually believed that there were thousands of children that had been kidnapped and imprisoned for menus and dinners and stuff.
Right.
And they believed that this was the first step in getting them freed.
I see.
I know how stunning that sounds.
Watching what we're seeing on TV, reading what we're seeing coming through the news, and again, I'm looking at it from one side. I don't necessarily see the other side, but it does make me wonder how somebody can watch what's being shared and not want to stray from the flock, from lack of a better way to put it, or the herd. Because I think, as you said, the wall around some of these herds are so strong that it is very difficult to get people to stray from within the herd.
Well, I see it a little bit different. What you said is definitely correct. I totally agree with you there.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that, or illustrates the need to have an educated electorate. And you happen to be privileged enough to know what reasonable evidence is. Now, I think everybody understands what reasonable evidence is until they get into the realm of esoteric politics and conspiracy theories, etc. But we teach our students all the time not to just look for resources, but to evaluate the validity of those resources. And we teach them how to do that, right? But there's a segment of society that is never challenged that way. It's difficult. It was difficult for me to accept the Bible as it, without questioning the fact that a human being wrote it, without questioning the history of how certain books are in my Bible and certain books aren't, and what they might say, and how it was chosen to put what was in the Bible, right? So if I'm a Bible thumper, and I use that word advisedly, where I just accept everything in it, then I'm no longer analyzing what I'm taking in, what I'm being exposed to. And just as we've talked about the three primary networks we grew up with, and that everything that we heard from them was just the facts, right? Then we found out that the facts weren't the facts, that the numbers we were seeing on the Vietnam War were skewed, that the predictions about who was winning was skewed. The amount of money we were spending was outright lies. Some of us sat there and said, I need something I can depend on, and to the extreme, and began to listen to every little conspiracy because they had been disenfranchised. This started a long time ago, not just with our former president. Our former president was just very good at using the disenchantment, and then use the bully pulpit to say, but you can believe in me.
Talking about pulpits and Bible thumpers, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but don't pulpit-based leaders create a very strong herd mentality as well? And
here we go again.
Yeah. So we've
Absolutely.
got all of these different herds that give you one piece of information and ask you to hang on tight.
Well, we started out by saying that there are many reasons to be in different herds
Yes.
for human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that when you start applying those, what you learn in one herd as the guiding principle for all the other decisions that you have to make.
I was going to use gospel, but go ahead.
I don't care. I just don't want to be disrespectful to any religion.
Right. No, I understand.
And,
I'm just
you
being
know,
sarcastic.
yeah.
I'm being glib.
Yes, gospel or rigid standard or Tea Party-ish, you know, where all I want is a balanced budget. I don't care about the outcomes.
The herd mentality extends itself into human healthcare with vaxxers and non-vaxxers as well.
Yeah.
Because you and I both have a science background, we would prefer to have evidence to support decision-making, evidence-based decision-making. But are there not individuals who will make a decision based upon the loudest noise that they hear?
Of course. And there are individuals that will make a decision regardless of the loudest noise that they hear.
Right. So the decisions to make strictly based upon science, which are what I tend to lean towards, or some sort of valid fact. Very interesting how we are able to get people to follow in a herd, not necessarily with facts, but with stories, fiction.
Well, I think I see where you're going, but you know, science can't solve everything either.
Right.
Solve the science. A scientific query does not result in an answer. It results in an option. And the answer has to consider the consequences on society. And that's where politics comes in. That's when we become confused. So let's take science. Let's take the science of viral transmission and put it up against the constitutional protection of our individual rights. And let's take pandemic we're in and then say that we were faced with a novel virus, as far as we knew, no human being had any experience with. And our best prediction based on the type of virus it was, et cetera, was that 1% to 2% of people were going to die or become seriously ill and require hospitalization when exposed. Now that sounds like a minuscule number, but 1% to 2% of America is 30 million people, 30 to 60 million people that's going to be exposed and could die if we gave that virus fertile ground to transfect the population. But in order to starve the virus, we would have to isolate ourselves. In order to starve the virus, we would have to separate ourselves from each other and do other things until we could come up with a biological protection to prevent that. And we chose to do that because we might be able to slow down the transmission so that our healthcare system could deal with the sick. Now, we did the best we could. And as a result, we had more people die from cardiovascular disease because we couldn't get them in the hospitals because all our nurses were being distracted by COVID patients. But in order to get that done, somebody had to make the decision to subvert some of our constitutional rights. We have always purported to have the right to move about. Freedom means just that I can go wherever I want, that I can have people over to my house whenever I want, that I can go eat wherever I want. And I don't have to wear a mask. And I don't have to do all these special things to protect the public, to protect the herd. And so science in and of itself, although it presented an option and said, here's one way of assuring that here's one way of reducing a projected number of deaths and morbidity. We had other people that do not appreciate the danger that science saw and therefore valued those constitutional rights more so than the danger. And we were ineffective in convincing them of that danger. And in some cases, it was because of the behavior of our own politicians.
But the head of the herd theoretically has the responsibility of protecting the herd.
I agree. Okay,
And
go ahead. Go ahead and slap them around. I'm not in disagreement of that. We had another problem in that the head of the herd was more concerned about his reelection than the health of the herd, and he knew how bad this was going to be.
well, that was the direction I was heading. I was heading in the direction that the head of the herd was making sure that he remained the head of the herd to the detriment potentially of members of the herd, with the hope that it would allow him to remain as head of the herd.
I was responding to the last question.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think part of the way to wrap this conversation up is that as we have these herds, no matter what they are, that there is an ability for herds to coexist. And that ability for herds to coexist means to work together towards a common good, and to use the other synonym of herd, HEARD, where you listen to what other members of different herds have to say and are open-minded to seeking ways to work together for the greater good. So herd mentality is probably good in the short run, and possibly in some cases in the long run, but herd mentality could also be detrimental, both short-term and long-term.
Well, the message I'd like to take away from this is that we have evolved from herd mentality. We have evolved from herd behavior, that we need to understand that a component of our behavior as a society includes herd behavior. But for the human race to continue to improve, we must focus on the conscious, cerebral decisions that we have to make.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.